Man, why does that sound so familiar? Have I heard that somewhere before? Wolfenstein 3D theme sounds like... Wait, what is this? Say what? Oh no.
How about new? I'm leaving. Yeah!
Wolfenstein 3D was the very first-person shooter I ever played, which is pretty appropriate since it basically invented the genre as we know it today. My brother and I would go over to our family friend's house, who's still our friend to this day. We were just kids, so we never got that far, but it never ceased to entertain us. After my first full playthrough in 2021, all these years later, it's held up pretty well. It's no Doom, but Doom wouldn't have existed if Wolfenstein hadn't shown the world that first-person shooters were the way of the future.
It's an older code, sir, but it checks out.
So let's get stuck into why Wolfenstein 3D and its expansion, The Spear of Destiny, are still worth getting psyched about. Wolfenstein 3D's development story begins with id Software at a crossroads. They were still fulfilling their contract with their old employer Softis to release several games such as Catacomb 3D, and id was looking to branch out into new creative territory. They felt they needed to expand their horizons beyond the successful kid-friendly Commander Keen series and work on something that truly appealed to their darker and more personal sensibilities. Romero suggested that they make a fast-action version of the 1981 stealth title, Castle Wolfenstein. This wasn't going to be the 2D hide-and-seek gameplay of the original. Romero wanted this game to be violent and adrenaline-fueled, like a World War II action movie. Nazi iconography would line the walls of Castle Wolfenstein. You'd see the chained skeletons of dead Allied soldiers, and you could even drink the blood of corpses if your health was below 11. The game was distributed via shareware by publisher Apogee Software, who would later become the legendary 3D Realms studio responsible for Duke Nukem 3D, among others. Shareware, for those who don't know, was a promotional technique where typically the first episode was made free to download and share with your friends in hopes of getting people interested in buying the rest of the episodes. And boy howdy did it ever, as 100,000 copies of Wolfenstein 3D were sold by the end of 1993 alone. Apogee didn't invent shareware, nor was Wolfenstein the model's first ever success, but it was the first of such magnitude. In fact, the game's reach was so broad that one Microsoft employee reported at the time that he could hear Wolfenstein guards screaming from nearly every room he went past in his office building for months after the game's release. Wolfenstein's protagonist was equally iconic. At the time, recognizable heroes weren't that common in first-person games, and Catacomb 3D had been the first real foray into this concept with Pet Neverhill. But every action movie needs its action hero.
You're goddamn right.
You play as top U.S. secret agent B.J. Blazkowicz, whose workload could be easily summarized as
Killing Nazis.
the hook is sweet and simple. Nazis bad and fun to shoot.
And I'm all out of bubblegum.
Much like Doom Guy, BJ is a singularly minded force of nature, always ready to answer the call to defend his country against the Nazi menace. That patriotic bent was reflected in the music by industry legend Bobby Prince, the composer of Wolfenstein 3D. It's classic MIDI stuff, but with minor key arrangements for several American standards interwoven into the original melodies composed for the game. Prince was also responsible for the sound effects as he was in Catacomb 3D. You'll get a lot of those similar bloop bloop noises from both games. Aside from a common sonic heritage, the two game structures are pretty similar too. Like Pet Neverhill before him, BJ's hands are visible on screen as you shoot, and his portrait changes based on the amount of damage he's taken. Both games are corridor shooters with ammo, health, and treasure pickups littered throughout. Now, while Catacomb 3D was leaning towards what would become id's design staples, Wolfenstein was the first full incarnation of id's emphasis on the player avatar and bloody, fast-paced combat. John Carmack's new engine was the primary contributor to Wolfenstein's speed. This engine utilized the texture mapping as had been inspired by an Ultima Underworld demo, and was combined with raycasting, which was prototyped in Hovertank and Catacomb 3D before it, a technique which increases performance by only rendering what the player needs to see. Each level's structure is 8 floors of killing Nazis and key hunting to open locked doors and find the level exit. Each episode culminates in a 9th floor with a boss. The layouts are a little boxy and often kind of look like someone building additions to a house, but with Legos. There are a lot of repeated assets throughout. Brick walls, metal doors, walls hung with Hitler posters and iron crosses, potted plants, tables, water wells, and other minimalist assets, sometimes at random.
But why though?
Romero later admitted that he didn't have much fun making Wolfenstein's levels compared to, say, Commander Keen's or Doom's, because there just wasn't much to them, and he even had to bribe Tom Hall at one point with the promise of a new Honda to keep him working on maps for Wolfenstein.
Yes! Yes! Oh God, yes!
Romero did try and spice things up a bit with a lot of push walls that hid secrets, but these two are predictably placed once you get into the rhythm of the game, as they're most often behind wall hangings, so the excitement of finding them isn't nearly as surprising or rewarding as, say, Doom. Now, while the levels aren't always interesting themselves, fortunately the action inside them will keep you playing. Any good shooter is defined by the quality of its guns, but Wolfenstein's weapons of choice do vary depending on which version you're playing. The SNES port added a flamethrower and a rocket launcher, but the base version that I played just had the classic pistol, knife, machine gun, and chain gun. Each weapon shares ammo, and since each new weapon that you pick up is better than the last, you've no need to ever switch back. This isn't a huge deal as combat doesn't require much strategy beyond watching corners and trying to get crowds to follow you through doorways to pick them off one by one, but it would have been nice to have a reason to switch weapons based on the enemy type like Doom later did. But you won't lack for satisfying sound design and gun feel. The pistol has a nice sharp report, while the machine gun sounds like someone blowing raspberries, you'll feel like a god once you get your hands on the chain gun. Running into rooms guns blazing like Chuck Norris and just mowing down all the bad guys before they even have a chance to turn around is awesome. Its bitchin' sound effect was way ahead of its time, and apparently this high quality was achieved because composer Bobby Prince was a veteran who had access to a shooting range and could capture realistic sound effects as he needed to, which is pretty cool. The Nazis at the end of your gun barrel have a lot of personality too, each type having a different call out for when they see BJ and also when they die. The detailed death animations where Nazis careen backwards and collapse into a bloody heap are impressive and satisfying, but you have to get them dead first. Enemies hit pretty hard and are able to one-shot you in the back if you're not careful. I actually played on the second hardest difficulty, Bring 'em On, which is comparable to ultraviolence and Doom, and there were definitely some grindy sections of dying and retrying over and over. Now, your average tan-clad soldier is just cannon fodder, but the SS guys can be a real pest in close with their submachine guns, and the officers with their long-range, high-damage pistols, and the mutants that fire incredibly fast can be a real challenge, especially in crowds. The bosses are suitably intimidating as they're the size of Mack trucks and require you to use the environment for cover. You often just need to run away, find the secrets in the room for extra health and ammo so that you can outlast the boss, and then just kite them until they're dead. But it's still an adrenaline rush to be pursued relentlessly by someone the size of the Hulk raining down hellfire on you.
Gotcha, bitch!
Okay, so that's Wolfenstein in a nutshell. It was a formative part of my childhood gaming, changed the industry forever, and remains one of the most important video games ever created, so it's gotta be near perfect, right? Well, not quite. Environmental repetition can really make the game drag. I mean, it was 1992 and I didn't give a shit when I was a kid, right? But it definitely doesn't catch the eye today like Doom still can. There are a lot of repetitive assets like the potted plants or tables or Hitler posters littered throughout the boxy rooms. Most things are the same color, and some levels really lean into tedious maze running. Combat can be a little frustrating too. If the enemies ever bunch up together, they can shoot through each other and hit you, but you can only hit whichever is most in front. In areas with lots of enemies where you're already having to go full Chuck Norris, this is a super cheesy way to die. The game also has this habit of placing enemies in little alcoves to the sides of doors so they can one-shot you in the back as you enter a room. Now, even if you get understandably paranoid and vigilant because of this, you'll still have to be lightning fast to get them before they jump out of their hiding place, as some have a reaction time of less than a second. I wonder if these design choices were to increase difficulty arbitrarily or were thought to mix up the rather straightforward gameplay. Either way, it feels like an overcorrection. Alright, so that's the main game. Although Apogee had run id fairly ragged for weeks after learning that they could churn out a level in just a day, id actually decided the final phase of their time with Wolfenstein would culminate in the Spear of Destiny, a prequel episode where BJ attempts to retrieve the Spear of Destiny from the Nazis. The spear pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion, and is thus said to make the wielder invincible among other powers, so naturally, the Nazis wanted to turn the tide of the war. Wolfenstein actually got supernatural a lot quicker than I realized, as I had always thought that 2009's Wolfenstein was the game that took it in this direction with its veil powers, bullet time, and Thule medallions and all that. Not so. The last surprise boss is also very Doom-like and would suggest what id's creative focus was turning towards. Now, other than the spark of creativity towards the end, Spear of Destiny mostly acts as more of the same. Episode 1 is billed as a 21-level prequel expansion, though I believe that's counting secret levels, as I definitely only played 18 or 19 floors in my run. The maps are more maze-like, and there's some really brutal combat encounters that just make you save scum like crazy. Chaining kills by using the 4 bullets you get from each dead enemy to hopefully pick off the next one, and then chain that onto the next, and so on. There's also quite a lot of the mutant enemies in this expansion too, which have the fastest reaction time and the highest damage output, even at long range, and there's some ridiculous configurations of them that are impossible to get through without kiting or cheese tactics. There's also one notorious level with 2 mandatory secrets behind push walls that I couldn't find myself only because of how finicky the activate button is. I clicked multiple times, maybe an inch to the side of the sweet spot on a wall, and was aghast when I finally saw someone else go through that same wall in an almost identical spot of activation.
Alrighty then.
Now, I enjoyed episode 1 of Spear of Destiny. Things certainly changed though in episode 2, Return to Danger, and episode 3, Ultimate Challenge. Now, these episodes are basically just remixes of the initial Spear of Destiny episode, as the Nazis have stolen back the spear, resetting the power dynamic back to where it was at the beginning of episode 1. The walls and the wall hangings are now ridiculous cartoon colors, and levels often devolve into mazes within mazes. Enemies have different sprites, your guns are now blue, and kind of look like Nerf guns, and the levels have new assets like ticking bombs and canisters all over the place. The sound's a mixed bag. On the one hand, the machine gun now sounds great, but the supposedly more authentic German callouts when they see the player are ruined by how overly loud and poorly mixed they are. The bosses are basically just reskinned, encounters play out mostly the same as before, and sometimes the developers didn't even bother to update the boss names to the quote-unquote new characters. There's a reason these 2 packs are often panned by fans in online forums. They're just not very good. I'd stick to the main game as Spear of Destiny Episode 1 so the game doesn't leave you with a sour taste. Now, if you're going to play Wolfenstein 3D in this modern age, do yourself a favor and download the EC Wolf mod. The default thing on Steam is just a mess, but thankfully EC Wolf supports WASD movement, extensive key remapping to your liking, and widescreen resolutions, which is great. So, a quick recap. Hovertank 3D and Catacomb 3D in 1991 were John Carmack's first forays in texture mapping and perfecting his trademark fast engines, as well as the first time that id focused on a recognizable avatar shown on screen and reflex-intensive combat. Wolfenstein was an upgrade to all of these tenets in every way. It was Carmack's best engine to date and was the first corridor shooter that ran at such a speed. On the other side of the industry, Blue Sky Productions was crafting a deep and reactive world in Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss, but id's Wolfenstein brought a rockstar swagger to shooters that made it instantly compelling. I mean, it's pretty hard not to get hyped up by a violent, bloody Nazi murder simulator where you get to fight Hitler in power armor, you know what I mean? Now, Wolfenstein can drone on a bit with samey levels and enemies, but the gun feedback, the adrenaline rush of enemy callouts as they see you and you engage them, the soundtrack, there's just something compelling about all of it together that says, go on, just play a little longer. By refining the hook in the gameplay into the most concisely fun forms they could, id made the game effortless to play and difficult to put down. But this wouldn't be the last time they pulled this off, nor would it be the most impressive. history was doomed to repeat.